From 1929 to 1945, Americans cooked 30 soups that kept them alive through the Great Depression. Soups that were part of everyday life. All 30 soups that were once famous started vanishing without explanation. The first 5 in this video are completely forgotten, and the last faded into history. Now we are about to rediscover these 30 cheap soups that got families through the Great Depression, starting with the first one nobody has ever heard of. Coffee soup became one of the most widespread Depression meals because every household had leftover coffee and nobody could afford to waste a single drop. Mothers saved the cold, bitter dregs from breakfast and reheated them in a pot with torn pieces of stale bread and whatever sugar they could spare from the ration tin. The bread absorbed the dark liquid and turned into a soft, coffee-soaked mush that resembled porridge but tasted like burnt toast dipped in weak morning brew. Children ate it without complaint because complaints meant going hungry entirely. Some families served this for dinner on nights when cupboards stood completely empty and paychecks were still days away. It cost nothing because everything in the pot was already destined for the trash. The soup filled stomachs even if it didn't truly satisfy hunger. Nobody wrote it down and nobody passed it to the next generation, because remembering coffee soup meant remembering shame. Onion peel broth sounds like a cruel joke until you realize Depression cooks threw away nothing, not even the papery brown skins peeled off onions before cooking. Women collected these dry, flaky peels in a jar throughout the week and boiled them in salted water to create a thin, golden broth that tasted faintly of onions and smelled like something real was cooking. The broth had almost no nutrition, but it was hot and it was brown, and it looked like soup when poured into bowls. Families drank it straight or used it as a base for other scraps like wilted cabbage or potato peels. The color fooled the eye into believing the meal was richer than it actually was. Making broth from garbage became a survival skill that kept families fed when actual onions cost too much. The recipe disappeared because admitting you boiled trash for dinner felt too shameful to repeat. Carrot top soup turned the leafy green tops that grocers usually discarded into a meal that fed entire families for almost nothing. Most people today throw away carrot greens without a second thought, but Depression-era mothers begged grocers for the tops after customers bought the carrots themselves. They chopped the bitter, feathery leaves and boiled them with diced potatoes, a bit of salt, and water until everything softened into a thick, earthy soup that tasted slightly bitter but filled empty stomachs. The greens were tough and stringy, but hunger made them edible. Some women added a spoonful of lard or bacon grease, if they had it, to make the soup feel richer. Children picked around the fibrous leaves, but ate them anyway, because leaving food on the plate meant someone else went without. Carrot tops were free, and that made them precious. The soup vanished when produce became affordable again, and throwing away greens stopped feeling sinful. Squash peel soup used the hard outer rinds and stringy seeds that modern cooks scrape into the compost bin without hesitation. Depression mothers saved every scrap of squash after using the flesh for other meals and boiled the peels with chopped onion, water, and salt to extract whatever flavor and nutrition remained trapped inside. The peels softened after hours of simmering and released a faintly sweet, vegetable-forward broth that thickened slightly from the natural starches. Some cooks mashed the softened peels into the liquid to make the soup feel more substantial. The seeds floated on top and could be scooped out or eaten whole, depending on how desperate the family was. It tasted bland and required heavy seasoning to become even remotely palatable. The soup existed purely because wasting food meant wasting money families did not have. When abundance returned and squash became cheap enough to eat fully, the peel soup disappeared and nobody mourned its loss.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Pea pod soup was brewed from the empty green shells left behind after shelling fresh peas, the same pods most kitchens toss straight into the garbage today without thinking twice. Women saved every pod in a bowl and boiled them in water with a diced onion and salt to pull out the sweet, grassy flavor locked inside the fibrous shells. The broth turned pale green and tasted faintly of fresh peas, even though no actual peas went into the pot. After an hour of simmering, the pods were strained out and discarded, leaving behind a thin, delicate soup that felt almost elegant, despite being made from scraps. Some families added a splash of milk, if they could afford it, to make the soup creamy. It cost nothing, because the pods were destined for the trash anyway. The recipe vanished when frozen peas replaced fresh ones, and pod soup stopped making economic sense. RE Hook 5 down, 25 to go. These first 5 soups came from literal garbage, things we throw away without thinking today. The next 5 push even further into desperation. Number 7 is nothing but hot water and animal fat. Number 10 uses only potato skins. Keep going. Depression bean water was exactly what it sounds like. The starchy, cloudy liquid left in the pot after boiling dried beans, reheated and served as soup when nothing else existed. Most cooks today pour this water straight down the drain, but Depression mothers saved every drop because it carried the faint flavor of beans along with dissolved starches that thickened the liquid into something resembling actual soup. They reheated the bean water with chopped onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes a tiny piece of salt pork if the family had any to spare. The soup tasted bland and watery, but it was hot, and it filled bellies for absolutely no additional cost. Children drank it from mugs because calling it soup felt more dignified than admitting they were drinking leftover cooking water. Some families served it multiple nights in a row after one pot of beans. The practice disappeared the moment families could afford to cook beans and eat them in the same meal. Hot water and lard soup represents the absolute bottom of Depression cooking. A meal made when literally nothing else remained in the house except a spoonful of lard and access to water. Women heated water in a pot until it boiled, then whisked in a tablespoon of lard or bacon grease until it melted and floated in greasy circles on the surface. They added salt and pepper, if any existed, and poured the thin, oily liquid over stale crackers or bread chunks to create something that resembled soup only because it was hot and served in a bowl. It tasted like salted grease water because that is exactly what it was. The fat provided calories, and the hot water created the illusion of a meal. Families ate it in silence because talking about what they were eating made the poverty feel even more unbearable. The soup disappeared the moment wages returned, and nobody ever spoke of it again. Wilted lettuce soup transformed the limp, browning lettuce leaves that grocers sold for pennies or gave away free into a warm meal that stretched farther than a salad ever could. Depression cooks took the sad, wilted leaves nobody else wanted and chopped them roughly before dropping them into a pot of boiling water with bacon, grease, vinegar, salt, and pepper. The lettuce cooked down into soft, slippery ribbons that floated in a tangy, fatty broth that tasted like warm salad dressing. Some families added diced potatoes to make the soup more filling. The vinegar brightened the flavor and masked the bitterness of the old lettuce. It cost almost nothing because wilted lettuce was considered garbage, and bacon grease came from previous meals. The soup filled stomachs even though it provided little real nutrition. When fresh produce became affordable again, wilted lettuce soup vanished because nobody wanted to eat garbage when better options existed. Bacon grease soup sounds impossible, but Depression families saved every drop of fat from cooking bacon and used it to create meals, when actual bacon became unaffordable. Women stored the grease in jars on the counter and spooned it into boiling water along with flour to create a thick, greasy, gravy-like soup. They added diced potatoes, onion, salt, and pepper to make it more substantial. The soup tasted intensely fatty and salty, with a strong bacon flavor even though no actual bacon appeared in the bowl. The grease provided calories, and the flour thickened the liquid into something that felt like real food. Children ate it because it tasted better than plain boiled potatoes, and the bacon flavor made it feel like a treat. The soup disappeared when meat became affordable again, and saving bacon grease for soup stopped being necessary. Nobody missed it, because eating pure fat disguised as soup felt desperate even by Depression standards. Potato peel broth came from the thin brown skins scraped off potatoes before cooking. Skins that kitchens today wash straight down the garbage disposal without hesitation. Depression mothers saved every peel in a bowl and boiled them in salted water to extract the starchy, earthy flavor trapped in the skins. The broth turned cloudy and pale tan, and tasted faintly of potatoes, even though no actual potato flesh went into the pot. Some cooks left bits of potato still clinging to the peels to make the soup feel more substantial. After simmering for 30 minutes, the peels turned soft and mushy and either got strained out or left in the soup, depending on how hungry the family was. The broth could be drunk on its own or used as a base for other scraps. It cost nothing and wasted nothing. The recipe vanished when potatoes became cheap enough to eat fully without saving the peels for soup. R.E. Hook, 10 down, 20 to go. The first 10 soups used scraps, peels, and leftovers most people consider trash today. The next 10 start to look more like actual soup, but remain forgotten. Number 13 is still just flour and water. Number 15 uses almost spoiled milk. Keep watching. Corncob soup extracted every last bit of sweetness from the bare cobs left behind after cutting off the kernels. Cobs that today get thrown into compost bins or fed to animals without a second thought. Depression-era cooks saved every stripped cob in a basket. They boiled them in a large pot of water for hours. This drew out the natural sugars and corn flavor, still trapped deep inside the woody cores. The resulting broth tasted surprisingly sweet and corn-forward, almost like the liquid from canned corn, but thinner and more delicate. Women strained out the cobs and added whatever they had on hand: dried beans, diced potatoes, wilted cabbage, or even just salt and pepper. This turned the broth into a filling soup that fed 6 to 8 people for nearly nothing. Some families ate corncob soup multiple times a week during late summer and early fall, when fresh corn was available and the cobs piled up in the kitchen. The cobs themselves got boiled 2 or 3 times before they stopped releasing flavor. Children drank the plain broth like it was a treat. The sweetness felt like dessert compared to the bitter, salty soups they ate the rest of the week. The soup disappeared completely when frozen and canned corn replaced fresh ears. Saving cobs for soup stopped making financial sense. Nobody writes about corncob soup in cookbooks. Admitting you boiled garbage for sweetness feels shameful even a century later. Was the ultimate waste-nothing strategy. A soup made entirely from the cooking liquid drained off every vegetable boiled throughout the week. Liquid most modern cooks pour directly down the sink without thinking twice. Mothers kept a large jar or pot on the stove. They added every drop of water left over from boiling potatoes, carrots, cabbage, turnips, beets, or greens. The jar filled with a murky, brownish liquid that smelled faintly of vegetables. It held whatever vitamins and minerals had leached out during cooking. At the end of the week, they reheated this collected water, seasoned it heavily with salt, pepper, and any herbs they could find. Served it as soup alongside stale bread or crackers. The flavor changed every week depending on which vegetables had been cooked, sometimes tasting earthy and sweet, other times bitter and metallic. The soup was thin and watery. Children hated the unpredictable taste but ate it anyway. Wasting food meant going hungry later. Vegetable water soup represented the absolute peak of Depression-era frugality. The idea that even the water vegetables touched was too valuable to throw away. The practice vanished the instant running water became cheap and unlimited. Saving vegetable water stopped being necessary for survival. Nobody today would dream of saving potato water for soup. Abundance erased the memory of why it mattered. Water gravy soup consisted of only two ingredients, flour and water, thickened into a paste and served as soup when absolutely nothing else remained in the cupboard, not even salt or a scrap of fat. Women heated a dry skillet until it smoked, then added a few tablespoons of flour and stirred constantly. The flour browned and toasted, releasing a nutty, almost burnt aroma. It made the kitchen smell like something real was cooking, even though it was just flour and heat. Once the flour darkened to a deep tan, they slowly whisked in cold water, stirred until the mixture thickened into a thin beige gravy. It resembled soup only because it was hot and pourable. The taste was flat and starchy, with a faint bitterness from the toasted flour. The texture was gluey and pasty, coating the tongue and throat with every swallow. Families poured it over stale bread or crackers to make the portions feel larger. Some added salt if any existed in the house. Many ate it completely plain because even salt cost money they did not have. Children choked it down in silence. Complaining about food meant disrespecting the mother who made it. Water gravy soup was survival food at its most desperate. Proof that hunger could make even flour and water seem like a gift. The recipe disappeared the moment wages returned. Flour could be used for bread instead of soup. Nobody ever wrote it down. Remembering water gravy soup meant remembering the feeling of having absolutely nothing left to eat. Oatmeal soup turned the breakfast staple into a savory dinner dish. When families ran out of rice, pasta, and potatoes, but still had a canister of cheap rolled oats in the cupboard. Unlike the sweet, cinnamon-spiced oatmeal eaten in the morning, this version was cooked in salted water or weak broth, with diced onions, a bit of lard, or bacon grease if available. Whatever vegetable scraps could be found, wilted celery, carrot peels, or cabbage cores, the oats thickened the liquid into a hearty, porridge-like soup. It stuck to the ribs and provided enough calories to keep working men and hungry children functional until the next meal. The texture was gluey and heavy, closer to paste than soup. The flavor was bland and earthy, unless heavily seasoned with salt and pepper. Some families added a spoonful of canned tomatoes or a handful of dried beans to make it feel more like a legitimate dinner. Children hated the slimy texture but ate it anyway. Oatmeal soup was cheaper and more filling than almost anything else their mothers could cook. The soup appeared on tables multiple nights a week in the hardest-hit households. It disappeared completely after the war, when rice and pasta became affordable again and oats returned to being strictly a breakfast food. Nobody missed oatmeal soup. Eating it felt like admitting you were too poor to afford real dinner. When prosperity returned, families wanted to forget they ever needed it. Skim milk soup used the thin, watery milk left behind after skimming off the cream to sell or make butter. Milk so stripped of fat that it looked almost blue and tasted like water pretending to be dairy. Depression families who kept a cow or bought milk directly from farms saved every drop of skim milk, turned it into soup by heating it with diced potatoes, onions, salt, and pepper, until the potatoes softened and released enough starch to thicken the liquid slightly. The soup tasted bland and faintly milky, with none of the richness of cream-based chowders. But it was white, and it was warm. It resembled something wealthy families might eat, which made it feel less desperate than drinking plain water. Some cooks added a spoonful of flour to thicken the broth further, or stirred in leftover mashed potatoes to make it heartier. The potatoes absorbed the milk and turned creamy on the outside. Even though the soup itself stayed thin, children drank it from mugs because it felt closer to a beverage than a meal. Families who could not afford whole milk relied on skim milk soup multiple nights a week. Skim milk cost half as much as whole milk and stretched twice as far. The soup vanished when homogenized milk became the standard. Skimming cream at home stopped being common practice. Nobody mourned its loss. Skim milk soup tasted like poverty. Once families could afford whole milk again, they never looked back at the watery substitute that kept them alive. 15 down. Halfway there, the first 15 soups used scraps, water, and whatever could be saved from the trash. The next 15 start to look more familiar, but still vanished completely. Number 20 is served cold. Number 24 is boiled 3 times. Keep watching. Bread soup turned stale. Rock-hard bread into a warm meal, when nothing else existed in the kitchen. Even bread too old to eat normally. Depression mothers saved every dried-out crust and heel in a basket, then boiled them in salted water with a chopped onion until the bread disintegrated into a thick, mushy porridge. The soup tasted bland and starchy, like wet cardboard flavored with onion, but it was hot and filling. It expanded in the stomach and made hunger disappear for a few hours. Some women added a spoonful of lard or bacon grease to make it richer. Others stirred in leftover vegetable scraps or a beaten egg if they had one. The bread absorbed the liquid and swelled, turning the thin broth into a paste thick enough to eat with a spoon. Children ate it without complaint because bread soup appeared on the table multiple nights a week. Complaining accomplished nothing. The soup cost almost nothing to make. Stale bread was free or nearly free. Water was free. An onion cost a penny. Families could feed 6 people for less than 5 cents. Bread soup vanished the moment sliced bread became affordable, and families stopped saving every crust. Modern kitchens throw away more bread in a week than Depression families ate in a month. Nobody makes bread soup anymore, because boiling old bread feels wasteful when fresh bread sits on the counter. The recipe disappeared along with the necessity that created it. Potato water soup was the leftover starchy, cloudy water drained off after boiling potatoes. Water most people today pour straight down the sink without a second glance. Depression cooks saved every drop in a jar, reheated it the next day with small chunks of leftover potato that clung to the peels or broke apart during cooking. The water was thick and milky from the potato starch. It tasted earthy and bland but resembled real potato soup if you didn't look too closely. Women added diced onion, salt, pepper, and sometimes a bit of flour to thicken it further. The soup turned pale and creamy, almost convincing if served in a bowl with crackers on the side. Some families ate potato water soup the day after every batch of boiled potatoes, because wasting the cooking water felt sinful when it still held flavor and nutrients. Children drank it like broth, never questioning why the soup had so few actual potatoes floating in it. The soup cost nothing. The potatoes had already been eaten. The water was headed for the drain. Turning waste into a meal felt like victory. Potato water soup disappeared when running water became abundant and cheap, when saving cooking liquid stopped being necessary for survival. Modern cooks boil potatoes and dump the water without thinking. They have no memory of a time when that water was dinner. The recipe vanished because remembering it meant remembering hunger. Mock oyster soup was a Depression-era trick that mimicked the taste and texture of expensive oyster stew using nothing but soda crackers, milk, and butter. Oysters were a luxury food that working-class families could not afford, but the creamy, briny flavor of oyster stew was so beloved that cooks invented a substitute. They soaked soda crackers in hot milk until they turned soft and slippery, then added a spoonful of butter, salt, and pepper. The crackers absorbed the milk and swelled into tender, oyster-shaped lumps that floated in the creamy broth like the real thing. Some cooks added a dash of Worcestershire sauce or a pinch of celery salt to make the flavor more convincing. The soup tasted rich and comforting, nothing like the garbage-based soups families ate the rest of the week. Children loved it because the crackers turned soft and the milk tasted sweet. Mock oyster soup felt like a treat, even though it cost only pennies to make. A box of crackers cost 10 cents. A cup of milk cost 5 cents. Butter was expensive, but only a teaspoon was needed. The soup fed 4 people for less than 20 cents. It vanished after the war when canned oyster stew became affordable, and families no longer needed to fake luxury with crackers. Nobody makes mock oyster soup today, because real oysters are available year-round, and pretending crackers are seafood feels ridiculous in an age of abundance. Dandelion soup turned the weeds growing in every yard into a free meal that cost nothing but the labor of picking them. Depression families walked through parks, empty lots, and their own front lawns, pulling dandelion greens before the flowers bloomed and the leaves turned too bitter to eat. They washed the greens carefully to remove dirt and bugs, then boiled them in salted water with diced onion and a small piece of salt pork, if the family could afford it. The greens cooked down into soft, dark ribbons that floated in a murky, greenish broth, tasting faintly bitter and earthy. Some cooks added diced potatoes to make the soup more filling. Others stirred in a spoonful of vinegar to cut the bitterness. The soup was nutritious. Dandelions are packed with vitamins and minerals, but it tasted like boiled weeds because that is exactly what it was. Children hated the bitter flavor but ate it anyway, because dandelion soup appeared on the table whenever money ran out. Picking dandelions was free. Cooking them into soup stretched the food budget. Dandelion soup vanished when lawns became ornamental, and pulling weeds to eat felt shameful instead of resourceful. Modern homeowners spray dandelions with poison. They have no idea their grandparents once ate them for dinner. The recipe disappeared because eating lawn weeds reminded families of poverty. Once they could afford store-bought vegetables, they never looked back at the dandelions growing outside. Amish cold milk soup was served ice-cold on hot summer days when lighting a fire to cook felt unbearable, and families needed to save firewood for winter. It was not cooked at all. Just cold milk poured into bowls with sliced bananas and a sprinkle of sugar. Eaten like cereal, without the cereal. The Amish communities who invented it treated cold milk soup as a light summer meal, something refreshing that required no fuel and no cooking skill. Just milk, fruit, and sugar stirred together in a bowl. The soup tasted sweet and creamy, like a banana milkshake poured over a spoon. Children loved it because it felt like dessert, even though mothers served it for lunch or dinner on the hottest days. Some families added stale bread cubes instead of bananas, or skipped the sugar entirely if none was available. The soup was filling despite being cold. Milk provided protein and fat. Bananas provided calories and sweetness. Cold milk soup appeared in Amish households throughout the Depression and beyond. Because it was cheap, fast, and required no firewood or electricity. The soup faded when refrigeration became common, and cold foods stopped being special. Modern families drink smoothies and eat yogurt bowls, without realizing their great-grandparents ate something similar out of necessity. Cold milk soup vanished because abundance made cold meals a choice instead of a sacrifice. And nobody wanted to remember the summers when lighting a fire felt too expensive. 20 down, 10 to go. The soups are starting to look more familiar now, but they still disappeared. The last 10 are the most recognizable. The ones that tasted good enough to survive but vanished anyway. Number 24 is boiled 3 times. Keep watching until the end. Turnip green soup used the leafy green tops attached to turnips, tops that most grocers today remove and throw away before the turnips even reach the produce aisle. Depression families bought turnips for the roots, then used the greens to make a second meal, stretching one vegetable into 2 dishes. The greens were tough and bitter, especially if picked late in the season. But hunger made them edible. Mothers chopped the greens roughly, boiled them in salted water with diced turnip roots, onion, and a small piece of salt pork or bacon if the family had any. The greens cooked down into soft, dark ribbons. The turnip roots turned tender and sweet. The broth tasted earthy and slightly bitter, with a faint smokiness from the pork fat. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar to cut the bitterness. Others stirred in cornmeal to thicken the soup into a porridge. The soup was nutritious. Turnip greens are packed with vitamins A and C, nutrients that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases, but it tasted like boiled yard clippings. Children forced it down because refusing meant going to bed hungry. Turnip green soup appeared on tables throughout the South, where turnips grew easily in poor soil, and greens were a staple vegetable. Families ate it multiple times a week during winter. When fresh vegetables disappeared from markets, the greens could be stored in a cool cellar for weeks, making them one of the few fresh vegetables available in January and February. The soup cost almost nothing. A bunch of turnips with greens attached sold for 5 cents. That fed a family of 6. Turnip green soup faded after World War II, when frozen vegetables became widely available, and families stopped relying on fresh greens. Modern grocery stores sell turnips without the greens, or charge extra for turnip tops marketed as a specialty green. People today pay premium prices for the same greens their grandparents ate out of desperation. The recipe disappeared because eating turnip greens reminded families of poverty, of winters when nothing else grew, of meals that filled the stomach but left the soul unsatisfied. Once frozen spinach and canned vegetables became affordable, families abandoned turnip green soup without looking back. Nobody missed the bitter taste, the stringy texture, the smell of boiled greens that clung to curtains and hair. Turnip green soup kept families alive, but nobody wanted to remember needing it. The recipe died with the generation that cooked it, buried alongside the shame of eating weeds for dinner. Cabbage and rice soup combined 2 of the cheapest ingredients available during the Depression. Cabbage that sold for pennies per head, rice that cost a few cents per pound. Together they created a filling, nutritious soup that fed large families for almost nothing. Mothers chopped half a head of cabbage into rough chunks, boiled it in salted water with a cup of uncooked rice, diced onion if available. The cabbage cooked down and turned soft and sweet. The rice absorbed the liquid, swelled into tender grains that thickened the broth. The soup tasted mild and slightly sweet, with a faint sulfur smell from the cabbage. Some cooks added a spoonful of lard or bacon grease to make it richer. Others stirred in canned tomatoes or tomato paste for color and flavor. The soup was plain, but it was filling. The rice provided carbohydrates and energy. The cabbage provided fiber and vitamin C. Together, they kept families functional, even when meat, dairy, and fresh vegetables disappeared from the budget. Children ate cabbage and rice soup without complaint, because it appeared on the table multiple nights a week, and complaining accomplished nothing. The soup stretched farther than almost any other meal. 1 head of cabbage cost 5 cents. 1 cup of rice cost 3 cents. Together they fed 8 people. That was 1 cent per person. Families could eat for days on a single batch. reheating the leftovers until the pot scraped clean. Cabbage and rice soup appeared in households across the country, especially in immigrant communities, where cabbage was a traditional staple. Eastern European families made it with caraway seeds. Southern families added hot sauce. Midwestern families kept it plain and simple. The sweetness of cooked cabbage, the comforting starchiness of rice, the sweetness of cooked cabbage, the comforting starchiness of rice. It felt like a real meal, not a desperate substitute, but it still vanished after the war, when meat became affordable again, and families wanted protein on the table every night. Cabbage and rice soup felt too plain, too poor, too reminiscent of hard times. Modern families eat cabbage rolls and fried rice, without realizing their grandparents ate something similar, out of necessity instead of choice. The soup faded because it reminded people of lack, of nights when cabbage and rice were the only options, of stretching 8 cents into 8 servings. Once abundance returned, families wanted to forget they ever needed to count pennies per person. Cabbage and rice soup disappeared quietly, not because it tasted bad, but because remembering it meant remembering hunger. Liver and barley soup turned the cheapest, most hated cut of meat into a thick, hearty soup. That provided protein and iron when steak and chicken were unaffordable luxuries. Liver sold for 5 to 10 cents per pound during the Depression, half the price of ground beef, a quarter the price of pork chops. But most people hated it. The strong, metallic taste, the grainy, crumbly texture, the smell that filled the kitchen, like pennies boiled in blood. Depression mothers bought it anyway, because feeding a family mattered more than taste preferences. They cut the liver into small cubes, soaked it in milk or vinegar for an hour to draw out the worst of the metallic bitterness, then drained it and added it to a pot with pearl barley, diced onion, carrots if available, salt, pepper, and water. The soup simmered for hours, until the barley swelled and turned tender. The liver cooked through and flavored the broth. The result was a thick, brownish soup that smelled like iron and tasted like dirt, but it was packed with nutrition. Liver is one of the most nutrient-dense foods on Earth, high in protein, iron, vitamin A, and B vitamins. The barley added fiber and carbohydrates. Together they created a complete meal that kept families strong even when money ran out. Children hated liver and barley soup. They gagged on the grainy bits of liver, the metallic aftertaste that lingered for hours. But mothers forced them to eat it, because iron prevented anemia. Protein built muscle. The soup kept children healthy. Even when meat was a once-a-week luxury, liver and barley soup appeared on tables across the country, especially in immigrant households, where organ meats were traditional foods. Jewish families made it with onions and dill. Irish families added potatoes. Polish families used sour cream. The soup was cheap. A pound of liver cost 10 cents. A cup of barley cost 5 cents. Together they fed 8 to 10 people. That was less than 2 cents per serving. Families ate it weekly, whether they liked it or not. The soup faded after World War II, when chicken and ground beef became affordable, and families stopped buying organ meats. Modern Americans avoid liver entirely. They have no memory of a time when liver was the only meat they could afford. Liver and barley soup vanished because it tasted like poverty, like desperation, like choosing nutrition over pleasure. Once families could afford better cuts of meat, they abandoned liver without hesitation. The recipe died because nobody wanted to remember. The metallic taste, the smell, the feeling of choking down food you hated, just to survive another day. Bone broth soup, made by boiling the same bones 2, 3, even 4 times, until every trace of flavor and nutrition was extracted, and the bones crumbled into powder. Butchers sold soup bones for pennies, or gave them away free to loyal customers. These were bones with almost no meat attached, just cartilage, marrow, and connective tissue. Depression mothers bought them anyway, because bones could be stretched farther than any other ingredient. They placed the bones in a large pot, covered them with water, added an onion, a carrot if available, salt and pepper, boiled the pot for hours, until the water turned brown and cloudy. The marrow melted out of the bones, the cartilage dissolved into gelatin. The first batch of broth was rich and flavorful, almost like real meat soup. Families ate it with cabbage or potatoes, sometimes noodles if they had flour. Then the bones were saved, boiled again the next day. The second batch was weaker, paler in color, thinner in texture, but it still tasted like something. Families ate it plain, or poured it over stale bread. Then the bones were saved again, boiled a third time. The third batch was barely more than hot water, with a faint ghost of meat flavor. But it was hot, it was free, it filled the stomach. Some families boiled the same bones 4 or 5 times, until the bones turned soft and brittle, until they crumbled when pressed, until nothing remained to extract. Bone broth soup represented the absolute peak of Depression-era frugality. The idea that even bones had value, that nothing should be wasted, that one purchase could create multiple meals, if you were willing to stretch it. Children drank the week later batches without complaint, because they understood the bones cost money. Wasting them meant wasting money the family did not have. Bone broth soup was common across all communities. Urban families bought bones from butcher shops. Rural families saved bones from chickens and rabbits they raised themselves. Everyone boiled them until nothing remained. The practice faded after the war, when meat became affordable and buying bones felt unnecessary. Modern bone broth is a trendy health food, sold in stores for $8 per quart. People today pay premium prices for the same broth their grandparents made from garbage bones. Boiled 4 times over, the difference is choice. Modern bone broth is a luxury. Depression bone broth was survival. The recipe disappeared because nobody wanted to remember. Boiling the same bones over and over, watching the broth get weaker each time, drinking it anyway, because wasting food meant going hungry. Once abundance returned, families wanted to forget. Salt pork and cabbage soup stretched a tiny piece of preserved pork into a pot big enough to feed 8 to 10 people. Salt pork was cheaper than bacon or ham because it was pure fat with almost no meat, just fatty scraps salted and cured to preserve them for months without refrigeration. A small slab cost 10 to 15 cents and could flavor multiple pots of soup. Depression mothers cut a 1-inch cube of salt pork, dropped it into boiling water, let the fat melt out, the salt dissolve, the tiny bit of meat fall apart into shreds. Then they added a whole head of chopped cabbage, diced onion, potatoes if available, boiled everything together until the cabbage turned soft and sweet. The soup tasted salty and fatty, with the mild sweetness of cooked cabbage, and the faint meatiness from the pork. It was not rich, not hearty, but it tasted like something, like a real meal instead of boiled vegetables. The salt pork provided just enough flavor to make the soup feel less desperate. Children ate it without complaint, because the salty, fatty broth tasted better than the plain vegetable soups. They ate the rest of the week. Salt pork and cabbage soup appeared on tables, multiple nights a week, in the hardest-hit households, because cabbage was cheap, salt pork was cheap. Together they created a filling meal. For less than 20 cents, the soup could be stretched even further. By adding more water and more cabbage, the salt pork flavored everything. Even when diluted to near translucence, some families ate the same pot for 3 or 4 days in a row, reheating it over and over, until every drop was gone. Salt pork and cabbage soup was especially common. In southern and Appalachian households, where salt pork was a traditional staple, and cabbage grew easily in poor soil, the combination was simple, reliable, filling. It kept families alive. When nothing else was affordable, the soup faded after World War II, when bacon and ham became widely available, and salt pork started to feel old-fashioned. Modern Americans avoid salt pork entirely, too fatty, too salty, too reminiscent of poverty cooking. 25 down, 5 to go. These last 5 soups tasted better than anything that came before. Good enough that they should have survived. But they vanished anyway because they reminded people of hard times. Number 30 is still eaten today, but nobody remembers why. Let us finish. Tomato water soup was made by diluting canned tomato juice with an equal amount of water to stretch 1 can into 2 meals. Canned tomatoes were expensive during the Depression. A single can cost 10 to 15 cents, more than a family could afford to spend on 1 meal. So mothers bought tomato juice instead, cheaper than whole tomatoes, then watered it down to make it last longer. They heated the diluted juice in a pot, added diced onion, salt and pepper, sometimes a pinch of sugar. To balance the acidity, the soup tasted thin and tangy, like watered-down tomato sauce, with none of the richness of cream of tomato soup, but it was red, it was warm. It looked like something served in a bowl. Mothers poured it over stale bread cubes, or served it alongside crackers to make the meal feel more substantial. Children drank it like broth because it tasted better than most of the soups they were forced to eat. The slight sweetness, the bright acidity, it felt almost like a treat. Tomato water soup appeared on tables across the country, especially in urban areas where families had no access to fresh garden tomatoes and relied entirely on canned goods. The soup was filling despite being mostly water. The acidity triggered saliva production, made the stomach feel fuller. The bread or crackers soaked up the liquid and swelled in the stomach. Together, they created the illusion of a complete meal. Some families added rice or noodle to make the soup heartier. Others cracked an egg into the boiling liquid, let it poach. The egg added protein and richness, turned tomato water into something that resembled real food. Tomato water soup faded after the war, when canned tomato soup became affordable, and watering down tomato juice stopped being necessary. Campbell's condensed tomato soup launched nationally in the late 1940s. It was cheap, convenient, richer and thicker than anything families could make. From watered-down juice, modern Americans eat tomato soup. Beet greens soup turned the leafy tops of beets into a free second meal after the beet roots were eaten or pickled for winter. Depression families bought beets, with the greens still attached, used the roots for one dish, the greens for another, stretching one vegetable into 2 meals. The greens were tough and earthy, with a slightly bitter, metallic taste, especially if picked late or allowed to wilt. But they were edible, and they were free. Mothers chopped the greens roughly, stems and all, boiled them in salted water with diced beetroots, onion, sometimes a splash of vinegar. The greens cooked down into soft, dark ribbons. The beetroots turned tender and bled their deep red color into the broth. The soup turned a shocking magenta, bright and vivid, like nothing else families ate. It tasted earthy and sweet, with a faint bitterness and a sour tang from the vinegar. The color was beautiful, but the flavor was polarizing. Children either loved or hated it. There was no middle ground. Beet greens soup was nutritious. The greens are packed with iron, calcium, vitamins A and K. The beetroots provided natural sugars and fiber. Together they created a complete meal that prevented deficiency diseases and kept families strong. The soup appeared mostly in Eastern European and Russian immigrant households, where beets were a traditional staple, and nothing was wasted. Families ate it multiple times a week during fall and winter, when beets were harvested and stored in cellars. Greens wilted quickly, so they were used first, before they rotted. The soup cost almost nothing, a bunch of beets, with greens attached, sold for 5 cents. That fed a family of 6 twice, once with the roots, once with the greens. Beet greens soup faded after the war, when grocery stores began selling beets without the greens attached, or charging extra for beet tops, marketed as a specialty green. Modern Americans buy beets pre-trimmed, with no greens, or they buy the greens separately, for premium prices. At farmers' markets, the same green their grandparents got for free and boiled into soup. The recipe disappeared because eating beet greens reminded families of scarcity, of using every part of the vegetable, because wasting the greens meant wasting money. Cornmeal soup was one of the simplest and cheapest soups families could make. Just cornmeal, water, and salt, cooked into a thin, savory porridge that resembled soup only because it was pourable and served in bowls. Depression mothers boiled water in a pot, whisked in cornmeal, a handful at a time, stirred constantly to prevent lumps, added salt, sometimes pepper, a bit of lard, or bacon grease, if any existed. The cornmeal thickened the water into a smooth yellow mush that tasted like bland corn with a gritty texture that coated the mouth and throat. Some families ate it thick, like porridge. Others added more water to make it thinner, more soup-like. The soup was filling. Cornmeal provided carbohydrates and calories, enough to fuel a day of hard labor, but it lacked protein and fat. Families who ate cornmeal soup multiple nights a week often developed pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency, common in the rural South, where cornmeal was the primary staple and meat was scarce. Symptoms included skin rashes, diarrhea, dementia, in severe cases, death. Cornmeal soup kept families alive, but it did not keep them healthy. Children ate it without complaint because it appeared on the table multiple nights a week in the poorest households, sometimes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The same pot reheated over and over until it was gone. The soup cost almost nothing. A pound of cornmeal sold for 5 cents. That made 10 to 12 servings, less than 1 cent per person. Families could eat for days on a single bag. Cornmeal soup was especially common in Appalachia and the rural South, where corn grew easily and cornmeal was a traditional staple. Families ate it with cornbread or fried cornmeal cakes. Corn at every meal, because corn was all they could afford. The soup faded after World War II, when rice and pasta became affordable and cornmeal returned to being a baking ingredient instead of a meal. Modern Americans eat cornbread. Dried corn soup used corn kernels that had been dried and stored for winter, a preservation method that allowed families to eat corn months after harvest, when fresh vegetables disappeared completely. Depression families bought dried corn for pennies per pound or dried it themselves by spreading kernels on screens in the sun until all moisture evaporated. The dried kernels were rock hard and shriveled, but they lasted for months without spoiling. Mothers soaked the dried corn overnight in cold water to rehydrate the kernels, then boiled them in fresh water with salt, onion, sometimes a bit of milk or cream, if available. The corn simmered for hours until the kernels softened and swelled and released their starchy sweetness into the broth. The soup tasted mildly sweet and corny, with a chewy texture from the rehydrated kernels. Some families added potatoes or cabbage to make it more filling. Others thickened it with flour or cornmeal to turn it into a thick porridge. Dried corn soup was nutritious. Corn provided carbohydrates and fiber. The soaking and cooking made it digestible. But like cornmeal soup, it lacked complete protein. Families who relied on it too heavily risked pellagra. The soup appeared on tables throughout rural America, especially in the Midwest and South, where corn was a primary crop and drying corn was a common preservation method. Families ate it multiple times a week. During winter, nothing fresh was available, and canned goods were too expensive. The soup cost almost nothing. A pound of dried corn sold for 5 to 10 cents, made 8 to 10 servings. Once rehydrated, dried corn soup survived longer than many Depression-era recipes because it actually tasted good. The natural sweetness of corn made it pleasant to eat, not just edible, but enjoyable. But it still vanished after the war, when frozen canned corn became widely available. Depression milk toast soup is still eaten today. Nobody remembers why it exists or where it came from. The recipe is simple. Toast bread until golden. Tear it into chunks. Place in a bowl. Pour hot milk over the top. Add butter, salt, sometimes sugar. Eat with a spoon. Modern people make it for sick children or as comfort food. They call it milk toast, not soup. They do not realize it was invented out of desperation during the Depression, when bread and milk were the only foods families could afford. Depression mothers made milk toast soup when cupboards were empty and paychecks were days away. They toasted stale bread to make it feel fresh, heated milk to make it feel substantial, combined them into something warm that filled empty stomachs and quieted hungry children. The soup tasted mild and sweet, like warm cereal, but without the cereal, the bread absorbed the hot milk and turned soft and mushy, easy to eat, even for toddlers and elderly people with few teeth. Families added cinnamon and extra sugar to make it feel like a treat. Others kept it plain and savory, with just salt and butter. The soup appeared on tables across the country, especially for breakfast or late-night meals. When nothing else was available, children ate it without complaint because it tasted better than most Depression foods. The sweetness, the warmth, the softness, it felt comforting, even when times were hard. Milk toast soup cost almost nothing. A slice of bread cost 1 cent. A cup of milk cost 5 cents. Together they made one serving for 6 cents, cheaper than almost any other meal families could prepare. The soup survived longer than any other Depression-era recipe because it transitioned to a comfort food for sick children and elderly people. The mildness made it easy to digest. Warmth soothed sore throats. It became a remedy instead of a poverty meal. But the soup is fading now. Modern families make it rarely. They feed sick children crackers and broth, chicken noodle soup from a can. Milk toast feels old-fashioned, outdated, strange. Young people have never heard of it. The recipe is disappearing because the generation that ate it out of necessity is dying, and the generation that made it for sick children is aging. Soon nobody will remember. That milk toast soup was once a Depression staple, a meal kept families alive. 30 soups that saved a generation and then vanished like they never existed. The first 15 were made from scraps we throw away today without a second thought. Coffee dregs, onion peels, potato skins, empty pea pods. Things we consider garbage. Last 15 looked more like real food, but they disappeared just the same, because even the good ones reminded people of hard times they wanted to forget. These recipes kept millions of Americans alive through the Great Depression and World War II, turned nothing into something, stretched pennies into meals, fed families when cupboards stood empty and paychecks were weeks away. Then the war ended. Supermarkets opened. Convenience foods arrived, and every family buried these recipes without looking back. Nobody wrote them down. Nobody passed them along to the next generation, because remembering these soups meant remembering hunger, shame, and desperation. Our grandparents boiled onion peels, reused bones 4 times, and served children soup made from flour and water. They survived. Then they buried the memory and never spoke of it again. Now these 30 soups are gone, erased by abundance. If this video reminded you of something your grandmother made but never explained, share it below. These stories deserve to be remembered.